Distinct pleasure of introducing our illustrious panelists for this session, titled Dilemmas and Trends in the Emerging Humanitarian Landscape. Emerging, and therefore discussions will be forward-looking, trying to anticipate and better yet prepare for what is to come and how we may navigate and perhaps even mitigate the challenges that arise in an increasingly unpredictable global environment. And so to address these, we have with us Professor Dewi Fortuna Anwar, who will be joining us shortly. I know she's around, so she couldn't have escaped. Dewi is a research professor at the Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency, among many hats that she wears. Most relevantly, she has written widely on Indonesia's foreign policy and ASEAN's regional political and security issues. Dewi also sits and has sat in a number of national and international advisory boards, for example, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, the HD Center since 2019, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in 2010 to 2020, and the UN Secretary General Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters in 2008 to 2012. And here she is. Welcome, Dewi. And next we have Dr. Mukesh Kapila, who is Professor Emeritus of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester. He is also Senior Advisor to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean and was former Under-Secretary General at the International Federation of Red Cross and Crescent Societies. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to Colonel Arai Nobuhiro, who is Chief of the Planning Section, Defense Cooperation and Policy Center, Policy and Programs Division, the Ground Staff Office of the Japan Self-Defense Force. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Pierre Prakash, who is the Asia Program Director, International Crisis Group. Mr. Prakash trained as a journalist, and he started his career as a foreign correspondent for French media in South Asia. He subsequently shifted to the aid sector, joining the European Union's Humanitarian Aid Department, first in New Delhi and then in Bangkok, covering the entire Asia-Pacific region. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. What I'd like to do is to start off by posing a broad question. You will each have 8 minutes to respond, maybe 9 if I am kind. After which we will go into 20 minutes of Q&A. So I'd like to remind the audience to please scan your QR codes and pose your questions there or your comments and reflections. And then we can move on from there. So without further ado, the question that I have is, amidst these geopolitical shifts that have impacted the humanitarian world, what do you see as the direction of travel? And what can be done to navigate these realities to best support those most in need? Dewi, please.
Thank you, Nan. My apology for being delayed. I thought we had still more time. It's very broad questions, but I think that a lot of the issues have been raised by our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Nolina, and I'll probably just be guilty of repeating a lot of things that she's been saying. But, we have various background here, and I'm a political scientist, more IR. So I'm going just to reflect, where we are now and where we are heading. Firstly, we talked a lot about the fact that geopolitical fragmentation is a real issue, and I don't think it's going to go away. This is going to be a more permanent feature now. Now, we can look at geopolitical fragmentation, geoeconomic fragmentation from a positive spin. There are positive things, the fact that we are living in a real multipolar world. And we'll welcome multipolarity because a hegemonic international order where only one country dominates for a long time, the Pax Americana, US-led liberal international order, from different perspectives, I tend to welcome the end of it, by the, the rise of other centers of power, the rise of China, the rise of Global South, India, Brazil, regional organizations, EU, ASEAN, and so on, and in various regions. You have the African Union, you have the Organization of American States, and so on. So this is real, and this should be celebrated, not seen as a threat. And in fact, again, from an IR perspective, we are not living in a multipolar world. We are living in what Amitabh Acharya calls multiplexity. Multiplexity means taking it from the cinema, where you have different genres of films playing at the same time. And in IR, this means that you have state actors. The most active roles still state organizations. So when we are talking about what is the future, the role of the states remain going to be very critical, for better or worse. But you also have other things. You have regional organizations, I mentioned earlier, but you also have private cooperation. You have non-state actors, for better or for worse. We have forgotten about terrorist organizations, but they used to shape the early days. So all of these actors, and then they have different approaches. So you are dealing in a much more complex world, which can call multiplexity. So that means that we need to be able to look at how the different actors and different approaches, the different possibilities could be grouped. And clearly, in a much more messy world, and we need to live with this messy world, our approach needs also to be less clear-cut, more imaginative, more hybrid, more pluralistic also. So we need to have a better way of division of labor, and I think this is the challenge, So who is going to be doing what and where? And are we going, I think the idealism is still that we need an international order based in the UN. And I think we still need to work on strengthening this UN system, because despite the lack of trust now, it is the only thing we have, and we need to strengthen that. But at the same time, for practical purposes, we now hear so much more about minilateralism, the coalition of the willing. So we need to be able to use this, employ this also, and the use this collaboration, public-private partnership. So there are many areas. Now the danger is that there's going to be we talk about the lack of funding, the lack of the real cut in aid, but this is not new. Remember in the 1990s, just after the end of the Cold War, there's huge cut in foreign aid. Firstly, because, let's face it, there's no such thing as truly neutral, altruistic foreign aid, even in humanitarianism. It's always tied to national interests. It's always tied to strategic interests. During the Cold War, aid was given for strategic reasons. So to prevent, in the free world, to prevent developing countries from siding with the other side, with the communists. So after the end of the Cold War, as we know, they say that it's not important anymore. It's not strategically important anymore. Also aid fatigue. And also then, you have financial crisis and so on. So the cut has always been there. So the trend has always been declining. There's been a raise during the terrorist attacks. Then there's a new aid surge, but for specific issues, for CVE, countering violence, extremism, and so on. And now you have so many things. Don't forget that violence, extremism is still there. Then you have the climate issues, and now wars are being normalized. We are back to the early 20th century, where countries invade other countries with impunity. And then you have, so you have traditional security threats, and what Al is doing, the non-traditional security threats, which tend to put interests together. The rule of thumb is that traditional security threats divide countries, but non-traditional security threats tend to bring countries together, because we need transnational approaches to deal with climate change, with pandemic, with non-state actors' threats like terrorism. But in today's realist politics again, even non-traditional security threats are being traditionalized, are being securitized in a traditional way. they are also being fragmenting. Now, and I think that this continues to be a major issue for us. For the way forward, I echo a bit, a lot about the needs to localize, to strengthen localization and so on. But at the same time, it's easier said than done. There is an assumption when you talk about localization, giving aid to local actors, there's an assumption that there is sufficient civic space, that there are non-state actors available, that there are civil society that are active. But usually in countries engulfed in war or in conflicts, where you mentioned, the state is the main perp, there's very little civic space. And to reach those non-state actors, you still have to go through the government. So how do you do this catch-22 situation? But I tend to be much more hopeful that we can be adaptive, but it has to be there's some changes also. For example, in Japan or South Korea, which are now playing an important role, there is a tendency that they don't want to work directly with civil society actors. They still want to work through the government, and so how do you circumvent these situations? Since I'm very much in support of greater localization, but not performative, real substantive support for capacity building. And now, from my experience, just finally, as I'm chair of the Habibi Center, which is a think tank, we work in promoting democracy and counterterrorism and so on. You find it quite difficult when you talk, local private sectors don't want to work with us because they see us as being critical of the power that be, despite the fact that, it's quite well established. So when you say, can local organizations support on issues which are critical to government, it's not easy. Thank you.
Thank you. We've covered quite a bit there, from multiplexity, which is also something that the scholar Acharya talks about, all the way to localization and, even to think about how would we better support things like mutual aid in reaching the people most in need. Thank you. If we can move on to Mukesh, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the first half of your question, which is about among the geopolitical shifts, where is the direction of travel of the humanitarian world? I see 4 or 5 key directions of travel. And you have to be careful you don't misinterpret what I'm saying, because what I'm saying is actually, having spent 30 years in the humanitarian business, for me to say some of the things I'm going to say actually pains my own heart, because it's actually a total reversal of all my professional 30 years of experience. But the fact is that if we just carry on thinking live in a dream world, then that's not doing the world any great favor. So the first thing I'm going to say is that the overwhelming of the humanitarian world is a new norm. That's because of the nature or the volume of the humanitarian threats, vulnerabilities, and risks are such that they're bound to be overwhelming, whether you look at the stressors like climate change, or whether you look at the stressors like the impact of conflicts, all of which have been referred to now. So number one, get used to a humanitarian world which is permanently overwhelmed. This is the new norm. It's like being in a global hospital where there are casualties coming through the door, and there is no respite. And you can't close the hospital because it's a hospital. My number 2 big trend is humanitarian aid is securitized and get used to it. And this goes back to some time of 20, 30 years. And I blame Mrs. Ogata for that great Japanese humanitarian who led UNHCR, because she introduced the term human security. We used to talk about human development, and now she turned it into human security. Now, recently we saw in COVID, we had health security, and Tedros in WHO is talking about global health security all the time, right? So we live in a world where the word language, the language of security has become toxified, because everything is now securitized. The military people, the people in uniforms here, they of course understand what's meant by security. But today, we as civilians have borrowed the military language to refer to everything else as also security. So we have global health security, we have climate security, we have drug security, we have this security, that security. So don't be surprised if the humanitarian endeavor has also become securitized. And then if you look at the strategic threats to it, well, the biggest threats to any country's physical security is not being attacked by China or Russia or even America. It is all the migration, the drugs, the criminality, and so on. So there is some logic in the securitization of the humanitarian sphere. The number 3 big trend is that we are living in an increasingly judgmental world. Gone are the days when you thought, poor person suffering from something or other, disaster, crisis, this, that, or the other, and universal humanity, and so on. Today, we make judgments. There's no longer such a thing as a victim and a comparable victim. Today, there are good victims and there are bad victims. There are good beneficiaries and bad beneficiaries. Now, we have to just realize that. Not everybody is a noble or virtuous recipient of compassion, and therefore the act of giving compassion, there is good compassion and there is misplaced compassion as well. Again, as I was saying earlier, not saying I agree with this or disagree with this, but this is what I'm saying, what I see. The number 4 thing I see is that we are beginning to live, and this is positive, in a new truth-telling age. So the myth around humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, independence, humanity, which we all brought up on, and at least in my case, tried to struggle with it for 20, 30 years. At last, we are saying the emperor has no clothes on. That aid has never been neutral, impartial, etc., whether it's development or humanitarian, but now we're saying it more openly. That's a good thing. The 4th, or 5th, I've forgotten now, is the more people are talking about trust. I mean, this morning the whole session was on trust, but that was on digital aspects of it. Well, I think the more you hear humanitarians worrying about trust, the more you realize they're failing. Because the person you distrust most is the person who shouts the most about trust. A trusted person doesn't have to shout about being trusted, right? 5th is this myth about resources. Never before in human history has there been so much money spent on humanitarian aid as now. Look at the statistics. Everyone is whinging and complaining because of the aid cuts from Western donors. It's true. But actually, the record volumes of humanitarian aid are being provided, at least up to last year. And the American situation is special, but I do not think we should make that special case the representation of the general case. Actually, much more humanitarian aid is being provided. It just isn't coming from Western governments, but it's not measured in the statistics of the UN. And that's the myth around volumes of aid. Now, let me move on then to the how to help people most in need, the second half of your question. Well, let me start off by what not to do. And that is, don't waste your time talking about UN Security Council reform, UN reform, this reform or that reform or the other. It ain't going to happen. And even if it was to happen, it doesn't make the better place. In my experience, I'm British, in relation to the Security Council, when I watch the non-permanent members of the Security Council, they behave no differently or no better than the permanent members. Any case, the Security Council is irrelevant, even if there was a reform. Because who is listening to the Security Council? I mean, General Assembly is good because it's the expression of the world's conscience, and from time to time, it's a good idea to listen to your conscience. So, but having listened to your conscience, you can put it aside. And then you come to the legal side, which is the Security Council. Well, actually, we live in a world where laws are not followed. Why should anyone follow the Security Council? But too many of my colleagues are wasting their time talking about Security Council reform. That's why countries like India are not interested in Security Council reform, because they don't want to be second-class citizens, non-veto holding permanent members, and so on. Now, two things before I conclude in terms of what I see as the direction of travel, strategic redemption in this area. The first thing is gradually to eliminate the word humanitarian. Now, where I live in Europe, nobody talks about humanitarian aid in domestic context. If you have a problem, you have a social security net, you get unemployment benefit, you get help from the local government, you get your pension, and so on. Now, the word humanitarian is a very colonial word, because it's applied in relation from the rich world saying to the poor world, you got problems, disasters, crisis, poverty, so here we give you humanitarian aid. Nobody talks about humanitarian aid in Germany or Britain or in the US, right? So it's the humanitarian business is entirely an artificial construct. Success of humanitarianism is about doing less. It's like being a good doctor is one, and I have a medical background, therefore I use medical analogies. A good doctor is one that actually administers fewer pills and potions, does less surgery, etc., etc. Now, unfortunately, we are in the opposite mindset. We are complaining there isn't enough humanitarian work going out there, and therefore humanitarianism is in a crisis, etc., etc. I would say that it's a crisis that is self-defeating, and in the end, it'll implode down along with all the other reasons I have mentioned. It's bound to fail.
Mukesh, may I please,
yeah.
may you, no,
9
not
minutes
about the
is
time, but can you hold your mic so everyone can hear you?
Okay. Sorry.
And you can wrap up.
I'm going to wrap up. And my second point, I'm not going to go into detailed prescription of innovation and digital and all the kinds of things. That's already been covered. Only talking about the big things. We want to move from a situation of not taking sides to taking sides. If you think about it, the default mode of humanity is to take sides. We help our neighbor, we care about our country. Nationalistic things are bad, but nationalism is a recognized part of the human condition. So I would say that the more there is people taking sides, the Russians looking after the Russian vulnerable cases, Ukrainians looking after their own, the Israelis looking after their own, the Palestinians and Arabs looking after their own, the better the world. So this myth about universalism and so on, and neutrality is the basis for actually doing less than the optimal of what can be done. This is what we can debate later on, if you like, Steve. Finally, therefore, let me conclude by saying, overall, if you believe in my thesis that we live in a world where humanity needs will be always overwhelming us, we live in a world where we'll always be failing to do more with less and less, and we're always, through that, going to disappoint the world, and by disappointing the world, we're always going to be losing more and more trust. That's the direction of travel. Therefore, the answer lies in defining humanitarianism much more tightly and in short way. Not defining all the world's problems as humanitarians. And finally, for humanitarians to accept, you cannot solve all the world's problems through the humanitarian route. And therefore, humanitarianism is not the default mode to the failure of everything else in terms of organization of human society. And then you come to the humanitarians who are then blamed for not doing enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Suffice to say, we've had an explosion of questions, which will give us a lot to discuss later on. But for now, thank you very much, and we'll move on to Colonel Arai, please.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, distinguished participants and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, RFIS, for inviting me in this wonderful session. I'm very happy to being with all of you. So for this panel, yeah, it's a very great question, great theme for the discussion. So I'd like to touch upon this theme part by part. So firstly, the understanding the emerging humanitarian landscape, my liberal view. So, and then the role of dilemmas and the role of trend, and then finally way forward. So firstly, the emerging humanitarian landscape. I see that the emerging humanitarian landscape refer to the changing the context in which humanitarian action takes place. Okay? Marked by the more complex crises, shifting the power dynamics, digital transformation, climate change, and political polarization. Humanitarian actors, including UN agencies, NGOs, local groups, and private sector partners, now operate in far more intercooperated but volatile environment. So looking into the role of dilemma, dilemma are the overall, the ethical, operational, and strategic tensions that humanitarians face situations where every choice carries both benefit and risks, harms. So these dilemmas play a crucial role because they force the examination of core principles of humanitarian, namely the humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence in new context. So I think that there are some key humanitarian dilemmas, including principle versus access. For example, should agencies compromise neutrality to gain access to affected population in politically sensitive areas? Another are the technology and protection, already touched upon in the morning session. How can data and artificial intelligence, AI, and data tools be leveraged for efficiency while safeguarding privacy and preventing surveillance or misuse? And also, I highlight short-term relief versus long-term resilience, which should be resources allocated to. And then next, the role of the trend. So I see that humanitarians serve as ethically test for humanitarian practices, pushing organizations to innovate, update frameworks, and clarify value amid uncertainty. Dilemma, in sense, shapes the moral evolution of humanitarianism. So the role of trend platform change that refine how humanitarian work is done. Recognizing and adapting to those trends is essential for relevance and effectiveness. So I see that some defining trends include for localization and power shift, climate crisis as a humanitarian driver, digital transformation, and blurring boundaries. It also mentioned in the morning session. So, in short, they functions as drivers adaptation, pushing the humanitarian system to evolve in structure, partnership, and mindset. They also highlight the need for anticipatory action and systemic resilience. So, 2 minutes remain. Okay. So, in summary, I think that the dilemma tests humanitarian values and ethics. It includes trust as well. And trends shape humanitarian practices and structures. So, together, they define trajectory of the humanitarian system, forcing it to balance principled actions with adaptive innovation. So that is my views for this second panel theme. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Colonel. This theme of humanitarian principles, and in particular neutrality, seems to be a running thing on this panel, and I think we can certainly address that later. There are quite a few questions on this. But without further ado, Mr. Prakash, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel. I have the unfortunate slot of coming last and having to repeat some of what my co-panelists have said, but I'll try to not be too redundant and offer a few thoughts. I mean, first of all, just to emphasize the scale and speed of the crisis that has hit the humanitarian sector in the last 8 months is unprecedented. This is a sector that's used to be in constant crisis in a sense, but what's happened in terms of funding in particular, but I would say there's also a crisis of legitimacy in much of the Western world about the very principle of aid, raises huge questions about the future of the sector as we know it. And I think the very first reality is that clinging to business as usual is just not going to cut it in the current circumstances. And this is not likely to change. If anything, the trends point to even less funding, as traditional donors, at least, channel funds to defense spending, and as I said, a number of right-wing governments question the very principle of aid, particularly given the economic circumstances in the Western world. So that implies that the sector will, unfortunately, need to make choices, I think, and to prioritize, and we see that happening. Dr. Heiser, this morning you mentioned, the global humanitarian overview speaks of over 300 million people in need, and only 114 million are going to be prioritized, and as we heard as well, only 30% of those appeals are funded at this point. So this raises very uncomfortable questions for those in the sector. I mean, will there still be funding for forgotten crises, or only for headline-grabbing crises, as I call them? Will there still be funding for sectors that are not necessarily considered as life-saving? For example, protection. Will gender-based violence programs still be considered central or just good to have? Will education programs for refugees still be considered even part of humanitarian aid, or is just no money for that? These are very difficult questions and require some radical shifts in the sector. At this point, this hasn't been brought up, so I didn't want to bring it up. I think there's an urgent need to multiply sources of funding, and as you happily put it this morning, Dr. Heiser, follow the money. I think the first port of call, this hasn't been discussed yet, but is non-traditional donors. And it's more about non-traditional donors getting into the system. Because I'm talking of Gulf countries, Turkey, China, for example. They have a very different way of working, which is largely government to government, but not exclusively, and which basically often doesn't go through the traditional humanitarian system, which creates a bit of a blind spot. I think that conversations comes with one about humanitarian principles as well. Maybe those donors are not as attached to the Western model of humanitarian principles, and some actually use instrumental aid, to buy influence. But at the very least, I would say that improving coordination and at least having visibility on what these actors are doing would basically allow for better complementarity and avoid overlaps that I've sometimes witnessed firsthand in humanitarian responses. Another source that needs to be explored or strengthened is international financial institutions. Mobilizing international financial institutions for humanitarian responses. We are already seeing that in places like Afghanistan and Myanmar. But I think it's something that needs to be strengthened and where the humanitarian community actually needs to advocate quite a bit for that. And then, of course, there's the private sector, which was briefly discussed this morning. That's also quite an uncomfortable conversation for many humanitarians, I think. At this point, I don't think there's much choice. I am speaking of private funding, not private operations like we saw in Gaza. The GHF is obviously an unacceptable precedent that should not be replicated. I fear that may actually be on the horizon as well, to be entirely honest. But even with new sources of funding, they're unlikely to make up for the massive shortfall that we're facing. I mean, let's not forget USAID alone was almost 50% of global international aid. And that means there will be more responsibility on countries, governments that traditionally have been recipients of aid, and regional bodies as well. And I think it's very much possible. In this region, we have the example of Indonesia, which, following the tsunami in 2004, where it faced an overcrowded humanitarian space with a lot of international actors, Indonesia has, over the last 2 decades, managed to successfully move to a nationally led approach to disaster management. It's not perfect, but it's working, and I think there could be ideas to be replicated there. When we're talking about regional bodies, of course, ASEAN in this region has created the AHA Center. I think a question to be asked at this point is, can the AHA Center evolve and maybe even morph to become a donor itself that funds NGOs for responses in the region, rather than the coordination agency that has been originally set up for? It obviously requires, it's a big reform. It requires governments earmarking funding. But when you consider that Southeast Asia is the region in the world the most exposed to natural disasters, it doesn't seem like a bad investment either. So maybe something to explore when we're talking about anticipatory action in the region. And then, of course, it goes without saying, but I don't think it's been said, invest in DRR, disaster preparedness, and there are great models in the region, particularly in the Philippines and Vietnam, for example. I think the trick for DRR is really institutionalization, which in the humanitarian sector, I witnessed a lot of pilot projects that actually don't then scale up. That's the challenge, but once again, I think the statistics are $1 invested in DRR is $6 or $7 saved in response. In a time of reduced resources, it makes a lot of sense. But beyond making choices and finding new sources of revenue, the future of the sector clearly depends on improving its overall efficiency as well. And this is what the much talked about, though I haven't seen it come up yet here, the humanitarian reset is about. I think we need to look at this as an opportunity, actually, for long overdue change and reforms in the sector. I realize that can be a jarring statement. I mean, a lot of us in this room probably have colleagues, friends, people we know who've lost their jobs or are on the verge of losing their jobs because of what's happening. But if you step back and look at the wider sector, there are clearly reforms that have been talked about, discussed for years, and never implemented. I'm actually struck to see how much the conversation around the humanitarian reset echoes almost word for word the conversation we had 10 years ago regarding the World Humanitarian Summit, about localization agenda, about cash, about more efficient coordination. It even echoes some of the transformative agenda in 2011. And yet these reforms haven't happened, or at least not on the scale they were meant to happen. But now that there is no money, the sector is pretty much against the wall, and that's, I think, an impetus for change. There is a divergence of views as to what that change should be. Some think it's about tweaking the system, basically keeping the existing system and reducing its size. Others are calling for a complete reinvention of the system. And the conversation about that latter version of reinventing the system very much has to do with something Mukesh mentioned, which is the colonial foundations of the humanitarian sector. and trying to engineer a shift to locally led responses that we've heard a lot about today already. I would argue that the main objective or the driving force behind all of this should be to come back to an authentic, need-based approach that puts the people, the communities that humanitarians assist, back at the center of the system, rather than the humanitarian organizations' mandates dictating what these organizations do, which unfortunately is too many times the case. I see time is running, so I'm probably not going to go into the details of how this improving efficiency can work, but we've heard about AI, I think we've heard about cash, those are things that need to be explored. There's also a need to do away with redundancies, and I'm actually quite surprised, we're hearing word in the UN of potentially merging some UN agencies, UNFPA, UN Women. There's even talk of UNHCR and IOM, which is somewhat surprising. There's scope for synergies there. And then there's a need to consolidate everything from supply chains to needs assessments to operations. And I find it quite surprising that, to be concrete, we often see organizations doing a needs assessment on their sector of activity, let's say WASH, and then another NGO comes and does the needs assessment on protection, on food, etc. So the same family of, let's say, an IDP family in Afghanistan is being assessed 5 different times. Why can't you have one NGO doing a consolidated needs assessment and then passing on that information to the others? It seems like there's really room for optimization there. The same goes for identity management, integrated programming, and then something that hasn't been discussed yet, but there's also too much subcontracting happening in the sector, and you can leverage efficiency by eliminating some of those layers, I think. And then, of course, we've heard a lot about it, I'm not going to go into it, but the localization, I would say commitments, because these commitments were made 10 years ago, and actually funding to local actors, at least in the traditional humanitarian system, has actually reduced since that time, there's just no good excuse for that, apart from the vested interests that are deeply entrenched in the sectors and that are basically guarding their, I was going to say their market shares. I realize that's a bit of a jarring vocabulary for this sector, but at the end of the day, that's the reality. The aid industry, it is an industry with market shares, with dominant players, with lobbyists, and with vested interests, and that needs to be recognized as we discuss all of this. I was going to add a word, if possible, because I think it's an important part of the way going forward on humanitarian diplomacy. And this links up to what you opened your statement with about the sort of growingly complex world that we're in and the geopolitical nature of the current moment. We're dealing with more difficult environments. Rule of law, IHL is increasingly challenged, human rights as well. Most of that with total impunity. And I think you need more coordination between humanitarian actors and the political actors that can play that role. If I take a concrete example, currently in Myanmar, the largest humanitarian donor is the EU. But the EU's diplomats don't want to engage with the junta out of fear of projecting legitimacy on the regime, which you can understand. But it's creating a situation where basically they're not pushing for the access that they need to have for the grants that they are giving to partners on the ground, NGOs. And I would add that this humanitarian diplomacy aspect is actually part and parcel of the efficiency. And to take a concrete example, right now in northern Rakhine in Myanmar, we have a huge food insecurity issue, which is largely the result of a blockade by the regime, because Arakan state has been seized by the Arakan army, so the regime is blockading and there are no commodities getting in the state, and so the prices have gone through the roof and there's huge levels of food insecurity. The other access to that state is Bangladesh. If we could get trade across that border, all of a sudden the prices would reduce and you would actually lessen the burden on humanitarian budgets to address that situation. That requires advocating with the Bangladesh government, and I don't want to go into details as to why they're not doing it. We can if you want. But that advocacy is not really happening, and that's a political dialogue. It's not a humanitarian dialogue. And I think that's where humanitarians also need to put the pressure on the political actors that can open up these channels for them. I will stop there because I'm way over time.
Thank you very much. I think you've touched on a lot of the issues that have been raised in general discussions around this room, and of course, throughout the year and at other forums and platforms as well. And one of them is, whether there might be some light in this dark tunnel where non-traditional donors, and you mentioned Turkey, China, you also talked about the AHA Center and whether they might become a donor themselves. And I wonder, actually, to this, whether, Devi, you would like to talk about that and the role of ASEAN and what can be changed or should be changed.
Thank you so much. But firstly, I'd like to intervene a bit on the human security things that I take your criticism about human security, but I remember I had to write about human rights in ASEAN. And when we look back to ASEAN, human rights was taboo. So the way we went about it is that we changed it to human security. So because you cannot address the issues of human rights violations, because human rights violations are not done mostly by non-state actors, but by state actors. But ASEAN governments are quite keen to ensure peace and security and stability, in particular also to ensure their regime longevity. So we approach it from a human security angle in a comprehensive way. As you know, ASEAN countries like social and economic development, but most of them don't like the civil and political rights of it. But when you say, human security is interlinked with each other, that you cannot simply address the social and economic issues, you have to address the political and civil society issues and so on. That's why, for us, human security is a good thing, because we can do it in a more depoliticized way. Now, talking about ASEAN, this is a problem for us. When we talk about putting people at the center, ASEAN says it all the time. ASEAN is people-centric, people-oriented, people-driven. But don't forget, it is like the UN, ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization. And some countries are much more willing to put people at the center and allow civic space. Indonesia, since the democratic transition, has seen a flourishing of civil society. Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand, despite its ups and downs, But not all ASEAN countries have this. So when we are talking about putting people at the center, when it is very much filtered through the regimes, it's a major challenge for us. And the AHA Center is a real positive development for ASEAN. But there are so many ASEAN experts here. Pak Ong was Secretary General of ASEAN. You know how much ASEAN pays, the ASEAN states. It is based on absolute consensus, and every member of ASEAN, regardless of its GDP, and now they have increased the contribution to ASEAN from 1 million to 2 million. But Singapore and Indonesia pays the same amount as the coming East Timor-Leste. So there's not much, it's not even enough to pay for the ASEAN Secretariat. So the activities for projects, ASEAN is still very dependent on its dialogue partners, particularly Japan, and other countries. So this is a challenge. Now, the idea is, how do we mobilize resources from non-state actors? So this is a challenge. Indonesia actually ranks quite top in the world in terms of gifting, because we have a lot of, Muhammadiyah, Nahdlatul Ulama, and various religious organizations and civil society. People are very charitable. People give a lot. But it tends to be very driven by immediate need. When you see catastrophes, people give. But when we're talking about capacity building in the long term, institutional building, that is not, that is no money for it. And this is the challenge, for immediate natural disasters, yes, people are quite willing. But for a long time, like the forced migration issue, in the beginning, when the Rohingyas issue first came, everybody wanted to give. Indonesia was very open and very welcome. People in Aceh was very welcome. But now you see a different thing. The people, I'm ashamed to say, behave in the same way that some very right-wing governments, the attitudes towards Rohingyas have drastically changed. The willingness to give is not there anymore. And I think that this is remain critical. So the bottom line is, though, we have much more room to move, but it needs more political reform as well. And I'm afraid, it is political at the end of it.
Thank you. And on that, I think I will ask the question that almost everyone has raised here, and that is on humanitarian principles. And Colonel Ara, you also talked about whether the principle of neutrality should be sacrificed to gain access. And I wonder if you and Mukesh would talk about that, since both of you raised that too.
So thank you so much for questions. So I don't mean that the humanitarian principle should be sacrificed, but it should be adaptive, right? So as I mentioned, so today's landscape has dramatically changed. So it means the on-site is very, very interconnected with the various actors, and also there is so volatile, fragile environment. And this landscape also forces the humanitarian actors, not only humanitarian actors, but also the military actors as well, test the traditional value and the ethics. So I mean that the most important thing we should consider is that how to reach out the most needed. So we need to find a way in accordance with given this current environment. So I mean that the adaptive approach should be considered. So, but of course I know that it's not easy for us, especially in the war conflict zone. I think that relatively the site of the natural disaster, it can be easier than the site of the war conflict. But I would say that if everybody stick to the traditional principle strictly, it cannot be made for the effective approaches to those who need it. So I think that we should be more adaptive, or to create the compromising way. Yeah, so that is my sense. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mukesh?
Well, I think the problem is with the word neutrality, in that the common sense meaning of the word in the public mind has a very bad meaning, because it effectively means that you don't really care. Now, if you would listen to ICRC Red Cross lawyers, they'll say that's a misunderstanding, because ICRC says, and I speak as an ex-Red Cross person, you are never neutral in the face of suffering, and you always take the side of the victim. So it's wrong to say that you're neutral in the face of suffering. And that's also the meaning of Resolution 46182 of the UN, which is, if you like, gave birth to the modern humanitarian movement, which adapted the Red Cross principles and turned it into a UN resolution, which is then adopted by member states, you see. So, unfortunately, we have lost the legal battle. And words, meaning is shaped by what people mean and understand. And the word neutral is therefore a bad word nowadays, right? Now, when it comes to actually the practice, you have to distinguish between strategic neutrality am I on the side of Russia or am I on the side of Ukraine? That's strategic neutrality that a country might say. Then there's operational neutrality, which is about how do I decide between two cases of suffering as to which suffering do I treat first and more of. And there, as I already said, there is no such thing as neutrality, at least in the humanitarian sense of the term. But we have another word for that called impartiality. In other words, needs-based. But you know, when we start talking like this, who are we talking to? And certainly not talking to the public. We might be talking to lawyers, or we might be talking to fellow humanitarians. So that's why I went the opposite direction, and which is to say, let us actually have a world in which we take sides. We take sides with the victims, if you wish to take sides with the victims. Take sides with the oppressor, if you wish to take sides with the oppressor, depending on your politics that you belong to. And the more we take sides, the more we're likely to confront the issue of how to meet needs and suffering. Because don't forget, the purpose of humanitarian action is to reduce suffering. There is nothing there that says that therefore, if you can reduce suffering more by taking sides and not being neutral, then what's wrong with that? So I think that's what I mean when you say we have to adapt, and I'm just putting the flesh on what you're saying, because the question is how to adapt. Well, I'm saying we live in the real world. Absolutely, we have to take sides. So if you are this country or that country or this organization or that organization, you must take sides according to your mission, whatever that mission is. And that means taking sides is not necessarily a bad thing. And one of the problems, and this is important, there is a myth that says that humanitarian values are universal. They are not. And the ICRC and others, they say, oh, well, all religions say the same thing, Islam, this and that, etc. They do not. If you study these religions, you will find there are important differences in the way in which humanitarian values are expressed in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Confucianism, and so on and so forth. And yet we have this myth saying, oh, well, these are universal values. It never existed. And this is why, what I was going to say earlier, all religions differentiate between a worthy recipient of humanitarian action or compassion and a non-worthy worthy recipient. These are not my words, and I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying the way it is. So I'm saying that it is not serving the cause of humanity when ideologues in the humanitarian system from the big organizations of the Red Cross and the UN seem to promote this mantra that somehow the world might blow off, but we have to stick to our religion of the principles. No, the principles are not given by God. They were created as recently as the 1960s, in a way. So I think we have to get over that particular myth. And we live in the world where we are operating more and more on a wholesale principle of humanity when people are wanting retail models. I mean, you know, in normal private sector, you have a customer service, and this business succeeds, this business doesn't succeed if you don't have good customer service. Now, in the case of the humanitarian system, we deliver humanitarian aid wholesale, when actually people want it retail. That's why there's so much dissatisfaction, and why quality is slipping. One last example, sorry. We hear the WFP, the World Food Program, is not getting enough money, and so what it does is cuts rations, right? So instead of giving you 2,000 calories, if you haven't got enough money for giving 2,000 calories to everyone else, cuts. So everybody gets first 1,000 calories, and everybody gets 500 calories, then it gets 200 calories, right? Completely useless strategy. It supports the issue of equality and all that kind of other things we are told about. But you don't have the World Health Organization saying, we've got one tablet of paracetamol left, and there are 10 people needing it. Let's cut the paracetamol in 10 equal parts and distribute them. That would be a completely useless use of paracetamol. And yet in food, which is more important than medicine, this is the approach we are taking. And this goes to the point of why humanitarian principles are actually making effectiveness of humanitarian action worse. Because nobody benefits from 100 calories of food. If you cannot give 2,000 calories, so you have to take sides. You have to decide who's going to get 2,000 calories and who's not going to get nothing. So this is just an illustration to say the most fundamental thing is not a reset of humanitarianism on how many chairs around the table are to be assembled. That's rubbish. That's for bureaucrats to do. And bureaucracy is not going to solve the world. And who is interested in merging this or that organization? Who cares? Whether it happens or it doesn't happen, it's not going to make much difference anyway. It is really the complete reset of minds that are required. And that's why I go to this thing. The answer is in doing less with less, not doing more with less, which is what the current mantra is in the hard-pressed humanitarian system. Doing more with less means that fewer people get lesser aid, they're more dissatisfied, you're spreading greater distrust, and you're achieving less results. Do you see the funny world we are now, the bad cycle we have got ourselves into? And yet people don't think that. And my worry with all the think tanks, including this one and other ones, is they do not do any new thinking. There's not a single new humanitarian idea that has emerged in the last 20 years, other than digital technology, which is a technique, it's not an idea. So and we're still stuck on the Geneva Conventions. Well, the reason nobody follows the Geneva Conventions is that the modern problems of the world cannot be solved by old laws. Laws in the real world evolve, as crimes evolve, as society evolves. We are stuck in the same old Geneva Conventions of 1962, the last one or wherever it was. No wonder, because the world has changed, but the laws have not changed. And when you criticize that, people say, they reiterate, you get little tweets on ICRC website, or you get Instagram posts and saying, reiterate humanity, impartiality, neutrality. Absolutely not. The future of the world is not going to be based on the laws and norms and principles to which worked fine in my professional life of 30 years. But if at my age I'm saying I have to rethink my thinking, it is not about going back to my golden days when I was doing humanitarian work. Now, I want that thinking to come out from your think tank and other people's think tanks. We need new humanitarian ideas, new norms, new values, new principles, not a reiteration of the old stuff, which, as I was going to say, is going to fail more and more and more because the needs are always going to overrun the capacity to meet them. Sorry, that wasn't your question, but I've answered it.
Thank you. Thank you. I hear a challenge for RSIS. Yes, Al? To come up with new ideas, be innovative. I also hear resonance with humanitarian resistance, or resistance to humanitarianism, right? As has been characterized in Myanmar a lot of the times now.
And in Sudan. Yeah.
And in Sudan, yes. And where mutual aid in Sudan is flourishing as well and doing very, very well.
And that's why, you see, I do not buy this myth about resources. The people who are saying that the humanitarian resources are reducing, yes, foreign aid is reducing. What are you saying? There's no data. The amount, whatever little data is in, and I don't know what the researchers are doing in this area, because by now we should be collecting more inclusive data about the real value of humanitarian assistance that's being provided. It's not being done. When you look at figures like 300 million people you need, I say, what, such few people? We live in a world of nearly 8 billion, between 7 and 8 billion, right? Only 300 million people. The UN says 300 million people. Rubbish. The way UN defines these people, and I know I'm a former UN humanitarian coordinator, it measures need according to its own self-assessed capacity of what it can do. And then when it says it's only got resources for 140 million people, maybe, but what does that mean? Implication is that the remaining 160 million people are going to die. We're going to have bodies on the streets. Well, of course not, and it's not happening. So this whole, we talk about digital whatnot and integrity and trust, but forget about digital. In our analog world, the data that is currently being massaged, manipulated, not collected, presented in a very partial way, not in a proper way, used in the slogans and humanitarian appeals. Obviously, people are going to respond to humanitarian appeals. Who has faith and confidence in humanitarian appeals. Why should I respond to an appeal for 300 million people when I know that the real vulnerability is probably close to 1 billion people? But where are those billion people? They're not in the system because they're not being counted. And as you know, in our world, when something is not counted, it doesn't exist. So what you're doing is the current system is disenfranchising hundreds of millions of people because they're not being counted by the official system. And my complaint against think tanks, including yours, is where's your research on all this? Where is the real numbers of vulnerability in the world? And where's the real numbers of the costs of aid not being provided? And I don't know whether a generation of researchers younger than me, why they're not working on this issue. Maybe because the donors who are funding these think tanks and so on, they have a vested interest. So I think if there is a lack of trust, it is in the research questions that are not being answered or being answered in a way that maybe think tanks are censoring themselves, as many people are nowadays. I think this should be what the Humanitarian Futures Forum is about, is to restore the integrity of this business and to get the brain working on these particular issues, and answering the data and the questions on which we know there are the capacity to address them, but there are political choices being made about not addressing them by researchers, not by governments, not by governments. And then think about solidarity. You know, if you are an African refugee, do you all want to come to Europe or cross over to the US?
Mukesh?
Nobody in the right mind wants to take asylum in China, for example. Look at Japan, look at South Korea, hardly admits anything. So if in Asia you want to talk about these things, don't forget the bad behavior in your own region that's currently taking place before you start condemning the rest of the world.
I think we have a lot of work now. Thank you. But on a more optimistic note, I have a question for you, Pierre. So you have a very specific question. The point on the aid industry having dynamics of market share and dominant players. What are some ways that NGOs can collaborate more instead of viewing each other as competition?
That's a big question. I mean, what I was referring to with that is the larger INGOs, largely, and the UN agencies. And the UN agencies I mentioned, I think there's some redundancies. Some have ventured much beyond their mandates to some extent. And in a period of scarce resources, it might make a lot of sense to come back to your original mandate and potentially, once again, merge some of these agencies. I think, you know, when it comes to larger INGOs, I don't want to be pointing fingers, because I think there is a realization amongst some of these NGOs. We had an initiative already a few years ago, the Pledge for Change to Decolonize Aid, I think was the full name of that, which is signed up by the largest NGOs in the sector. But they themselves are struggling with it because they have become too big to change, in a sense. And I think that's what I meant by dominant players, is that, if I'm going to simplify, you have a handful of donors distributing money to a handful of big actors who then hopefully redistribute some of that money. But there's a concentration of power, which is largely in the Western world, because these NGOs are all Western. And so that realization is there, but they're struggling to operationalize, I would say, more honest partnerships with local organizations. We're still in a dependency kind of architecture between INGOs and national or local organizations. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about giving up power, and nobody wants to give up power. So there is going to be a bit of tussling here. But some of these organizations, I think, you know, if you remove, I mean, this problem was, just to come back to the funding aspect, in 2023, I think 62% of humanitarian funding was coming from 3 donors. Okay, you obviously had a massive dependency problem, and that just blew up in the sector's face when USAID collapsed overnight. Of course, it happened, as I said, quicker than anybody could anticipate. But there were some, you know, dysfunctions, sort of systemic dysfunctions in the sector that were very unhealthy. So now's the opportunity to rectify them. How can they collaborate more? I tend to think that they need to actually empower local organizations, which is detrimental to their interests. So I'm not very hopeful that you know, they will be very proactive in doing that. But once again, if you want a leaner, more responsive, I would say, more efficient and cheaper system, you're going to have to shift the center of gravity to local actors rather than international and more expensive international actors.
Thank you. We've actually run out of time, but I would really like to ask Dewi if you can maybe give us a final thought in concluding this panel. And on that note.
I really love this, but it's a real challenge, your question, putting the spot back on researchers and so on. That's very comfortable. So I think we need another workshop just particularly on this. But I like to take up, from this localization issue that's been brought up, and it's an area as well. We need to move there, not simply because of the budgetary crunch, but also because of the first responders. The local people do know better of what, the local needs are. In the mapping and everything, you do need to have that, but not in a colonial way. So sometimes, capacity building does have this patronizing connotation, right? And we do need to move away from the boomerang aid. The more you throw it away, the more it comes back to the original giver, to the 3 major contractors and so on, and using local NGOs simply as forced labor, minimum wage, but they collect most of the data and so on. So honesty is very important here, and the willingness to give up power. But at the same time, I think that we also need, every time we point finger at others, 3, back to us, we are talking, we celebrate the emergence of multipolar world, of multiplexity, but rights also come with responsibilities. And that also means that we need to step up more. Now, the idea is, but how do you coordinate? And who will be doing the coordinating? My worry is that, coming from, I will not mention other countries, a lot of the NGOs are, first, their civic space is shrinking, democratic regression is real. The China model, I'm afraid, is very attractive now. Command economy, command political system, the people are no longer hiding their admiration of that, even so-called democracies. So how do you deal with genuine local actors, not simply actors that are co-opted by the government and controlled, and marginalizing those who do not comply? Because then there's also this danger of widening the gap. Those in real need are often in conflict areas who are dissenters, and they will be deprived. Because, as I said, at the end of the day, it's still the government. Now, and ASEAN, we need to revisit our ASEAN Charter. We put, in the original ASEAN way, we talk about sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference, and we have elevated this into sacred principle, which is a UN Charter principle. But in the ASEAN Charter, we have new values like democracy, human rights, rule of law, constitutional government, and our idea is not non-interference. Our focus is non-indifference. So when we are approaching this, do not only look at non-interference. You cannot afford to be indifferent. But we also need to make, sometimes a very frontal approach is not possible. So if you have to use the word human security, non-indifference, and so on, so be it. You can use a lot of euphemisms, but what we need to do is to go multiple approaches, put it that way. So if there's one word, multiplexity and hybrid. Thank you.
Thank you. If you can join me, please, in thanking the panel for a very, very robust discussion.